안녕하세요. 환영합니다. 오늘은 일반적인 원예 트렌드를 넘어 흙과 식물, 그리고 실제로 효과가 있는 단순한 시스템에 담긴 진정한 지혜를 깊이 파헤쳐 보려 합니다. 발코니에서 허브를 키우거나 뒷마당에서 채소를 재배하거나 작은 텃밭에서 가족을 위한 먹거리를 기르며 항상 더 나은 방법을 찾는 분들께 이 이야기를 전하고 싶습니다. 정원의 제품이 하나 더 필요할 때마다, 흙 한 봉지가 더 필요할 때마다, 혹은 가게에 한 번 더 가야 할 때마다 답답함을 느끼셨던 분들께 말씀드립니다. 건강한 토양, 튼튼한 뿌리, 꾸준한 성장, 그리고 실용적이고 자연스러우며 저렴한 방식을 중요하게 생각하신다면 저와 끝까지 함께해 주시기 바랍니다. 이것은 여러분의 정원을 위해 배우게 될 가장 유용한 지식 중 하나가 될 것입니다. 수년 동안 우리는 생산적인 정원을 만들려면 비료를 계속해서 사야 한다고 배워왔습니다. 식물의 영양분은 공장에서, 복잡한 시스템에서, 그리고 우리를 소비의 굴레에 가두는 값비싼 투입물에서 나와야 한다는 말을 들었습니다. 하지만 자연은 언제나 조용하고 효율적이며 관대하게 자신만의 방식을 유지해왔습니다. 잔잔한 물 위에서 놀라운 속도로 번식하는 아주 작은 부유식물이 있습니다. 적절한 환경만 갖춰진다면 이 식물은 화단과 퇴비, 그리고 그 이상을 위한 영양 풍부한 녹색 바이오매스를 지속적으로 제공할 수 있습니다. 잠시 생각해 보십시오. 단순한 양동이 하나, 약간의 물, 그리고 한 줌에 살아있는 초록색 생명체만 있으면 됩니다. 거의 아무것도 아닌 것처럼 시작된 것이 집에서 바로 자가 재생되는 자원으로 빠르게 변할 수 있습니다. 비용을 절감하고 더 건강한 토양을 만들고 포장된 솔루션에 덜 의존하고 싶은 정원사들에게 이것은 단순히 흥미로운 수준을 넘어 삶의 주도권을 갖게 하는 일입니다. 가장 놀라운 점은 이것이 어떤 새로운 발명품이 아니라는 것입니다. 이것은 이미 검증된 오래된 지혜이며 왜 더 많은 사람이 이에 대해 이야기하지 않는지 의문이 들게 하는 종류의 지식입니다. 오늘 논의에서는 이 식물이 무엇인지, 왜 그렇게 빨리 자라는지, 무엇이 그토록 가치 있게 만드는지, 그리고 여러분이 어떻게 가장 간단한 방법으로 일을 시작할 수 있는지 밝혀낼 것입니다. 마지막에 이르면 여러분은 다시는 비료를 예전과 같은 시각으로 보지 않게 될지도 모릅니다. 이제 이 모든 것 뒤에 숨겨진 큰 질문부터 시작해 보겠습니다. 왜 우리는 애초에 비료에 그토록 의존하도록 배워왔을까요? To understand why this little bucket of floating green matter is so powerful, we first have to look at the system most gardeners and farmers have been taught to depend on. At the center of that system is one essential nutrient: nitrogen. If you want lush leaves, strong stems, vigorous growth, and deep green plants that look truly alive, nitrogen matters. It is one of the core building blocks of healthy growth, and without enough of it, even the most carefully watered garden can struggle. Now, here is the strange part. The air around us is already full of nitrogen. In fact, most of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. You would think plants could simply take what they need from the air and grow freely from what surrounds them every day. But they cannot use nitrogen in that form, directly. It has to be converted into a form they can absorb through the soil or water. That single limitation shaped modern agriculture in a huge way. For more than a century, the world has relied heavily on a massive industrial solution called the Haber-Bosch process. This is the method used to capture nitrogen from the air and turn it into synthetic fertilizer on a large scale. It made modern agriculture possible, but it also created a system built on factories, energy consumption, fossil fuels, transportation, packaging, and constant purchasing. What looks simple when you pick up a bag of fertilizer at the garden store is actually tied to a very heavy and expensive chain behind the scenes. That chain comes with a cost. It takes enormous heat, intense pressure, and a huge amount of energy to manufacture synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. Over time, heavy dependence on these inputs can also push growers into a cycle where soil biology becomes less central, natural fertility becomes less valued, and every growing season starts to feel like another round of buying what your land is no longer encouraged to build for itself. That is the illusion at the heart of the fertilizer world. We have been taught to believe fertility only comes in a bag, that plant nutrition must be purchased, measured, and reapplied through outside products. But nature solved the nitrogen problem long before modern industry ever existed, quietly and efficiently, without smokestacks, fuel bills, or supply chains. She built living systems that could gather fertility using sunlight, water, air, and biological partnership. Once you understand that, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. What is this tiny plant that can do what factories work so hard to imitate? 재배 세계에서 가장 간과되어 온 작은 강자 중 하나인 아졸라 에이졸라를 소개합니다. 첫눈에는 그리 인상적이지 않습니다. 아주 작고 섬세해서 무시하기 쉽습니다. 잔잔한 물 위에 부드럽게 떠서 마치 장식처럼 보이는 아름다운 녹색층을 형성합니다. 어떤 이들은 이를 물고사리라고 부르고 다른 이들은 요정 이끼나 개구리밥 고사리로 알고 있습니다. 어떤 이름을 사용하든 이 작은 부유식물은 놀라운 이야기를 담고 있습니다. 아졸라는 물 위에 떠서 자라는 수생 고사리이며 연약한 외형과 달리 적절한 조건에서는 믿을 수 없을 정도로 빠르게 자랍니다. 이것이 바로 아졸라의 능력을 진정으로 이해한 정원사, 농부, 토양 전문가들이 주목하는 이유 중 하나입니다. 적은 양으로도 빠르게 증식하여 평범한 물통을 살아있는 바이오매스의 원천으로 바꿀 수 있습니다. 원예에서 바이오매스는 매우 중요합니다. 한 줌의 초록색 물질은 잠재적인 비옥함, 미래의 퇴비, 멀칭제, 토양 개량제이며 땅으로 돌아갈 준비가 된 저장된 식물, 에너지입니다. 하지만 아졸라의 이야기는 정원을 넘어 더 넓은 시각으로 볼 때 더욱 놀라워집니다. 이것은 단지 뒷마당 재배자들을 위한 유용한 고사리가 아닙니다. 이 식물은 지구 역사에서 깊고 매혹적인 자리를 차지하고 있습니다. 약 5천만 년 전 지구가 지금보다 훨씬 따뜻했던 시기에 과학자들은 북극의 거대한 담수 표면에 아졸라가 광범위하게 번성했다고 믿습니다. 이 아졸라들이 살고 죽으며 가라앉으면서 엄청난 양의 탄소를 격리하는 데 도움을 주었습니다. 즉, 이 작은 고사리가 아주 오랜 시간에 걸쳐 지구의 기후를 변화시키는 데 역할을 했을 수도 있다는 뜻입니다. Just imagine that for a moment. A plant so small you can scoop it with your hand, yet powerful enough to be discussed in the story of global climate change. That is part of what makes Azolla so exciting. It reminds us that in nature, size is often misleading. Some of the most important systems are also the quietest ones. Some of the greatest solutions do not arrive with noise and complexity. They arrive floating gently on the surface of a bucket. Once you start to see Azolla that way, not as a weed or pond scum, but as a living engine of growth, it becomes much easier to understand why generations of growers found it so valuable. Still, the real secret is even deeper than the fern itself, because the true magic of Azolla comes from a microscopic partnership hidden inside each tiny leaf. 이 부분부터 이야기가 정말 흥미진진해집니다. 아졸라 자체도 인상적이지만 재배자들에게 아졸라가 그토록 중요한 진짜 이유는 그 내부에 있는 살아있는 파트너십 때문입니다. 매우 긴 진화의 역사 동안 아졸라는 아나베나, 아졸라, 에이나베나, 아졸라에 라고 알려진 미세한 남세균과 긴밀한 관계를 형성해 왔습니다. 이 파트너십이 바로 이 작은 부유 고사리를 겉보기보다 훨씬 더 가치 있는 존재로 탈바꿈시킵니다. 아졸라의 잎이 구멍 안에는 육안으로는 보이지 않지만 식물의 힘에 절대적으로 필수적인 이 작은 동반자들이 살고 있습니다. 고사리는 이들에게 은신처를 제공하고 광합성을 통해 생성된 에너지 풍부한 당분을 공급합니다. 그 대가로 남세균은 놀라운 일을 해냅니다. 대기 중에 질소를 포집하여 식물이 사용할 수 있는 형태로 전환하는 것입니다. In other words, they help turn air into fertility. That conversion is not simple. Nitrogen gas is abundant, but it is also incredibly stable, which is why plants cannot just grab it directly. The cyanobacteria inside Azolla use a special enzyme system to break those strong bonds and transform atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, a form that can enter biological cycles and eventually feed plant growth. This is one of the most elegant examples of natural cooperation you will find in the growing world. This is exactly why Azolla matters so much in a garden or farming system. You are not simply growing a water fern. You are cultivating a living fertilizer factory powered by sunlight. No smokestacks, no industrial processing, and no endless chain of manufactured inputs. Just a biological relationship doing what nature designed it to do. For those of us who care about healthy soil, resilient gardens, and long-term fertility, this is the kind of knowledge that changes how we see growing altogether. It shows us that the answer is not always adding more products. Sometimes the answer is understanding life more deeply, and then putting those living relationships to work in ways that support the land instead of exhausting it. Once people recognized what Azolla was capable of, they did not keep that knowledge to themselves. In fact, long before modern gardening channels, books, or agricultural companies existed, farmers in Asia were already using this floating fern in practical, brilliant ways that fed communities for generations. 더욱 놀라운 점은 아졸라가 최근에 발견된 원예 기법이 아니라는 사실입니다. 이것은 실제 농업 역사에 깊이 뿌리내린 오래된 지혜입니다. 현대 농업이 화학적 투입물에 의존하기 훨씬 전부터 아시아의 농부들은 이미 이 부유 고사리를 실용적이고 신뢰할 수 있으며 믿을 수 없을 정도로 효과적인 방식으로 활용하는 법을 익혔습니다. 중국의 역사 기록에 따르면 11세기까지 거슬러 올라가 벼 재배에 아졸라를 의도적으로 사용한 사례가 나옵니다. 농부들은 논표면에 이 고사리가 자라도록 장려했을 때 특별한 일이 일어난다는 것을 이해했습니다. 물은 생물학적 활동으로 살아있게 되었고 토양에는 지속적으로 비옥함이 공급되었으며 벼는 더 튼튼하고 건강한 성장으로 화답했습니다. 베트남과 아시아의 다른 지역에서 재배자들은 아졸라 묘포를 유지하고 추운 시기에 이를 보호했다가 파종기가 돌아오면 다시 논에 퍼뜨리는 계절적 방법을 개발했습니다. This was not accidental. It was knowledge refined through observation, repetition, and generations of experience. That is something I always respect in agriculture. Farmers do not keep repeating a method for hundreds of years unless it delivers real results. They may not have described it in scientific language, but they knew what they were seeing. They saw better growth, more productive fields, and they saw that this tiny floating plant was helping feed the crop in a natural, renewable way. Modern research later confirmed what traditional growers had already understood through practice. When Azolla is integrated properly into rice systems, yields can rise significantly, often in ways that compare surprisingly well with synthetic fertilizer programs. That is what makes this story so important. It shows us that biological fertility is not a romantic fantasy, or just a nice idea for people who want to garden naturally. It is something that has already worked on a meaningful scale across real landscapes for a very long time. For centuries, Azolla helped support fertile, productive land without demanding the endless cycle of outside purchasing that so many growers now take for granted. Once you see that clearly, it naturally leads to a question that deserves to be asked. If this plant is so useful, so practical, and so well proven, why do so few people hear about it today? That brings us to the part of the conversation that makes many growers stop and think. If Azolla can grow quickly, help build fertility, support crops, and do it with very little cost, why is it not discussed more often? Why do so many gardeners know the names of brand-name fertilizers but have never heard of a living system like this? Why do garden centers have aisles full of products, yet almost no one is handing beginners a bucket with a handful of Azolla and saying, "Start here"? A big part of the answer is economics. Modern fertilizer systems fit neatly into a model built around recurring purchases. Every season, growers are expected to come back and buy again. More nitrogen, more feed, more amendments, and more inputs. Once that pattern becomes normal, people stop questioning it. They begin to assume that fertility must always come from outside the garden, outside the farm, or outside the living system itself. In the 1970s, when energy prices surged and the cost of synthetic fertilizers became more unstable, interest in alternatives like Azolla increased. Researchers took a closer look, studies explored its potential, the scientific value was there, and the practical promise was clear. But when industrial inputs became more economically comfortable again, that urgency faded. Like so many low-cost biological solutions, Azolla remained on the edges instead of becoming a standard part of mainstream growing education. The truth is, a self-replicating resource does not fit easily into a system designed around repeat sales. Azolla does something very unusual in economic terms. Once you have it, you can keep growing it. A small amount becomes a larger amount, and then that larger amount becomes a continuing source of fertility. It does not ask you to keep opening your wallet every few weeks. It asks you to understand it, manage it, and harvest it well. Maybe that is exactly why it feels so empowering. The moment a grower realizes that fertility can be cultivated, not just purchased, something changes. You stop seeing yourself as a consumer of plant products and start seeing yourself as a steward of living systems. That shift matters. Now that we have uncovered the why behind Azolla's value, it is time to get practical and talk about how to set up your own simple system at home. 아졸라의 장점은 시작하는데 온실이나 비싼 도구, 복잡한 장비가 필요하지 않다는 점입니다. 사실 이것은 여러분이 구축하게 될 가장 간단한 비옥함 공급 시스템 중 하나가 될 것입니다. 용기에 물을 채우고 적절한 장소에 놓을 수만 있다면 시작할 수 있습니다. 첫 번째 단계는 용기를 선택하는 것인데 완벽함이 목표가 아니므로 마음을 편하게 가지시길 바랍니다. 플라스틱 양동이, 얕은 대야, 콘크리트 혼합용 트레이, 오래된 세면대 또는 더 많은 양을 원한다면 유아용 풀장을 사용할 수도 있습니다. 가장 중요한 것은 잔잔한 물을 담을 수 있어야 한다는 점입니다. 깊이가 얕은 구조는 빛이 수면에 쉽게 도달하고 나중에 수확하기가 훨씬 간단하기 때문에 특히 효과적입니다. 소규모 가정용 시스템의 경우 수심은 약 10벨치세로나티엔테사안949유인치 정도가 시작하기에 매우 적당한 범위입니다. 다음은 물입니다. 구할 수 있다면 빗물이 가장 좋습니다. 수돗물을 사용하는 경우에는 아졸라를 넣기 전에 하루 정도 그대로 두어 염소가 증발하게 하는 것이 좋습니다. That small step can make a real difference, especially when you are trying to establish a healthy living culture, rather than just fill a container. After that, you want to give the water a little nutritional support. Azolla is famous for helping capture nitrogen. But like any living plant, it still benefits from access to phosphorus, minerals, and trace nutrients. This does not need to be complicated. A handful of fertile garden soil or a little compost added to the container is often enough to create a richer starting environment. Some traditional growers also use a very small amount of manure slurry or a bit of wood ash to broaden the nutrient profile. The key is not to overdo it. You are creating a living medium, not a heavy feeding program. Then, choose the right location. Azolla enjoys warmth, but it does not love harsh, punishing sunlight all day long. Partial shade is usually ideal, especially in hotter climates or during intense summer weather. A spot that gets bright light, but some afternoon protection works beautifully. Under a tree with dappled sun, along the side of a greenhouse, near a shaded patio, or in a calm corner of the yard can all be excellent choices. If conditions are too hot and bright, Azolla can become stressed, and you may notice it turning reddish instead of staying lush green. Finally comes the easiest step of all: inoculation. Once the container is ready, you simply add your starter. A first handful is the seed of the whole system. From there, nature takes over. Given decent warmth, gentle light, still water, and a little mineral support, it begins to spread across the surface and build new biomass surprisingly quickly. That is the moment when the idea stops being theory and becomes a living process right in front of you. A bucket that looked ordinary suddenly becomes productive. Once that green surface begins to thicken and multiply, the next question is no longer how to start, but what to do with all that growth once it begins to arrive. 아졸라가 자리를 잡기 시작하면 금방 눈에 띄는 변화가 생길 것입니다. 아졸라는 오랫동안 작은 상태로 머물지 않습니다. 얇은 녹색층으로 시작된 것이 곧 용기 표면 전체로 퍼질 수 있습니다. 그것이 바로 처음에 의도한 모습입니다. 여러분의 설정이 제대로 작동하고 있으며 조건이 적절하고 이 작은 생물학적 시스템이 설계된 대로 작동하고 있다는 신호입니다. 하지만 건강한 성장이 과잉 번식으로 변하는 시점이 오는데 이때부터는 올바른 관리가 중요해집니다. 아졸라를 수면에 너무 빽빽하게 방치하면 층이 서로 겹쳐지기 시작합니다. 그러면 빛이 아래쪽까지 제대로 도달하지 못하고 공기 순환의 균형이 깨지며 군락의 일부가 약해지기 시작합니다. 활발하고 생산적인 배양 대신 쇠퇴하게 되는 것이죠. 따라서 수확은 단순히 유용한 바이오매스를 모으는 일이 아니라 시스템을 건강하고 성장 가능한 상태로 유지하는 과정의 일부입니다. 여기에는 다음과 같은 간단한 규칙이 아주 잘 적용됩니다. 기후에 따라 증식 속도가 다르겠지만 보통 며칠마다 절반 정도를 수확하는 것입니다. 따뜻한 조건에서는 3일에서 7일마다 수확할 수 있습니다. I like to think of it as skimming abundance. You are not emptying the system. You are taking the excess, giving the remaining Azolla room to breathe, room to spread, and room to come right back stronger. This is where the real reward begins because the material you harvest is not waste. It is green gold for the garden. One of the easiest ways to use it is as a fresh mulch. You can spread it directly around tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, leafy greens, or any plant that benefits from steady, gentle feeding. As that soft green layer breaks down, it returns nutrients right where your plants need them most, near the root zone, while also helping the soil surface stay more protected. Another excellent use is to work it lightly into the top layer of your garden beds before planting. This gives the soil biology something fresh and nitrogen-rich to process, and it helps build a more active, fertile environment before your next crop goes in. If you are preparing a bed for heavy feeders, this can be a very smart step. Azolla is also incredibly useful in compost. If your pile tends to be heavy on dry leaves, straw, cardboard, or woody material, adding fresh Azolla can help balance things out. It brings moisture, softness, and nitrogen, all of which help speed decomposition and make the whole pile feel more alive and active. For growers who enjoy liquid feeding, Azolla can be soaked in water for a few days to make a nutrient-rich tea. Once strained, that liquid can be applied around plants as a quick, biologically active boost. It is one more way to turn a simple bucket culture into something immediately useful across your whole garden. By this point, Azolla is already proving itself as a powerful tool for soil and plant health. But its usefulness does not stop with vegetables and compost. In many growing systems, it goes one surprising step further and becomes valuable not just for the garden, but for the animals that support the farm as well. 자, 이제 많은 분의 눈을 번쩍 뜨이게 할 부분입니다. 특히 뒷마당이나 소규모 농장에서 닭, 오리, 물고기 또는 더 큰 가축을 키우는 분들이라면 더욱 그럴 것입니다. 아졸라가 토양뿐만 아니라 동물들도 먹여 살릴 수 있다는 것을 깨닫는 순간, 이것은 단순한 원예 팁이 아니라 하나의 완전한 지원 시스템처럼 느껴지기 시작합니다. 사료비는 소규모 재배자들에게 가장 큰 지속적인 부담 중 하나입니다. 가축이나 가금류를 짧은 기간이라도 키워본 사람이라면 누구나 이를 이해할 것입니다. 청구서는 매달 쌓여가고 가격이 오르면 타격이 큽니다. 집에서 재배하고 빠르게 증식시켜 그 비용의 일부를 상쇄할 수 있는 자원이 있다면 진지하게 주목할 가치가 있습니다. 아졸라가 이 분야에서 큰 관심을 끄는 이유는 그 영양가 때문입니다. 적절하게 재배하여 올바른 방식으로 사용하면 아졸라는 귀중한 미네랄, 비타민과 함께 풍부한 단백질 공급원이 됩니다. 질감이 부드럽고 수분이 많으며 거친 구조적 섬유질이 적어 많은 동물이 거친 식물성 재료보다 더 쉽게 소화할 수 있습니다. That matters because feed is not only about what nutrients exist on paper. It is also about how usable those nutrients are inside a real living animal. Backyard chickens often take to fresh Azolla very naturally, pecking at it with enthusiasm once they recognize it as food. Ducks tend to enjoy it as well, which makes sense for a floating aquatic plant. In integrated systems, fish can benefit from it too. In some farming contexts, Azolla has been explored as a partial supplement for cattle and other livestock, helping reduce reliance on more expensive commercial feed. The important thing here is balance. Azolla is not a magic replacement for every feed source in every situation, but it can become a very useful part of a broader feeding strategy. It gives small growers one more homegrown option, one more layer of resilience, and one more way to turn sunlight, water, and simple management into something practical and valuable. That is what makes it so exciting to me. The same bucket that supports your tomatoes can also contribute to your chickens. The same living system that feeds your compost can also help lower input costs elsewhere on the homestead. When one resource begins serving multiple purposes, the whole growing system becomes smarter, tighter, and more regenerative. And if that were not enough, Azolla still has one more role to play. Beyond fertilizer and feed, it also brings something many of us are craving more than ever now: environmental healing. One of the reasons I find Azolla so compelling is that it does not only solve a gardening problem, it speaks to a much bigger need. We live in a time when people are waking up to the damage caused by runoff, overuse of chemicals, exhausted soils, and disconnected growing systems. More and more gardeners want methods that do not just produce results, but also leave the land better than they found it. This is where Azolla begins to feel like a true environmental ally. When it forms a healthy mat over still water, It creates a natural surface cover that can change the ecology of that space in useful ways. One of the most talked about benefits is mosquito suppression. A dense Azolla layer can make it much harder for mosquitoes to access open water for egg laying, and it can interfere with the conditions larvae need near the surface. For growers dealing with small ponds, water tubs, or still water areas, that alone can make Azolla worth paying attention to. 하지만 환경적 가치는 그보다 훨씬 더 큽니다. 집에서 직접 기르는 모든 영양분은 에너지 집약적인 시스템을 통해 제조, 운송, 포장 및 유통되어야 하는 합성 비료를 사지 않아도 된다는 것을 의미합니다. 정원에 넣는 한 줌의 아졸라는 지역적 영양 순환을 실천하는 작은 행동입니다. 이는 식물에게 영양을 공급하는 일이 식물이 실제로 사는 곳 근처에서 더 많이 일어나고 외부 산업 투입물에 의존하는 일은 줄어든다는 것을 의미합니다. 이는 수질에도 중요합니다. 현대의 비료 남용으로 발생하는 큰 문제 중 하나는 유출수입니다. 과잉 영양분이 토양을 떠나 시내, 연못, 강, 그리고 더 큰 수로로 흘러 들어가 심각한 생태적 불균형을 초래합니다. 하지만 비료 성분을 더 부드럽게 기르고 더 직접적으로 적용하며 살아있는 순환 구조 안에 묶어두면 낭비와 피해의 위험을 줄일 수 있습니다. The whole system becomes more contained, more thoughtful, and more in tune with how nature already works. Then there is the bigger symbolic power of it all. Azolla reminds us that healing does not always begin with massive infrastructure or complex technologies. Sometimes it begins with a person, a bucket, a little water, and a willingness to grow differently. Sometimes the most meaningful environmental action starts in a backyard, in a garden bed, or beside a small homemade tub of floating green life. By now, Azolla has shown itself to be much more than a curiosity. It can support fertility, feed compost, contribute to animal systems, and even offer ecological benefits beyond the garden gate, which naturally leads to one final and exciting question. If something this simple can do so much, how far can it really scale? One of the most powerful things about Azolla is how easily it scales. The same living principle works whether you are growing on the smallest level or thinking much bigger. If you live in an apartment and only have room for one bucket on a sunny balcony, you can still begin. If you have a backyard and enough space for a few shallow tubs or kiddie pools, you can expand that system without much difficulty. If you are managing land on a larger scale, the very same idea can be adapted into ponds, lined beds, or dedicated water tanks that produce far more biomass over time. That is what makes this plant so special. So many useful growing methods become complicated as soon as you try to expand them, but Azolla stays simple. Water, light, warmth, a little mineral support, and a starter culture. That is the foundation whether you are growing a handful for kitchen garden mulch or building a more serious fertility system for a homestead. The size changes, but the principle does not. 이런 단순함은 찾아보기 힘듭니다. 또한 이는 우리에게 농업과 원예의 미래에 대한 더 깊은 질문을 던지게 합니다. 왜 우리는 시즌마다 매년 똑같은 필수 투입물을 계속해서 사야만 하는 시스템을 이토록 당연하게 받아들이게 되었을까요? 자연이 항상 재생, 갱신, 재사용에 기반한 모델을 제시해 왔음에도 불구하고 왜 우리는 의존성을 정상으로 받아들일까요? 그 과정 어딘가에서 많은 재배자는 비옥함을 과정 프로세스이 아닌 제품 프로덕트로 생각하도록 배워왔습니다. 하지만 비옥함은 결코 단순한 거래가 되어서는 안 되며 구축되고 순환되며 관리되어야 하는 것이었습니다. Every time you harvest a handful of Azolla and return it to your garden, you are stepping out of that old pattern. You are no longer just feeding plants. You are participating in a closed-loop system. You are taking sunlight, water, air, and living biology and turning them into resilience. You are strengthening soil instead of simply stimulating it. You are creating a resource that grows back instead of one that disappears the moment you use it. To me, that is what the future of farming should look like. Not more dependence, but more intelligence, more observation, and more systems that become richer over time instead of more depleted. Azolla may be small, but it points toward a much larger truth. When we learn to work with living processes, we stop fighting nature and start multiplying what she already does best. After everything we have explored today, it brings us right back to where we began with one simple image that now means something much bigger than it did at the start. A bucket of water covered in green. A simple bucket of water. A handful of floating ferns. At first, it almost sounds too easy. But sometimes the most powerful ideas are the ones that look humble from the outside. What we have really been talking about today is not just a plant. It is a way of thinking, a way of growing, and a way of rebuilding the connection between fertility, biology, and the grower. For more than 1,000 years, people have known that Azolla could help feed crops, enrich soil, and support more self-sufficient growing systems. That knowledge never disappeared because it failed. It disappeared from everyday conversation because modern systems moved in a different direction. But the beauty of gardening and farming is that useful wisdom can always be recovered. The moment one person starts sharing it, testing it, and passing it on, it begins to live again. So here is my challenge to you. Find some Azolla, set up your first bucket, watch it grow, harvest it, and put it back into your soil. See what happens when you stop relying only on what comes from a store shelf and start building fertility with your own hands. Your garden does not need more complexity. It needs living systems that work with nature instead of against it. And one of those systems may be floating right in front of you. If this story of the tiny fern has changed the way you look at the potential of your own backyard, please subscribe and like this video. We are dedicated to uncovering the natural wisdom and history that has been overlooked for too long. Let's grow a more resilient future together. The next hidden treasure of the soil will be revealed soon. Keep digging, keep learning, and keep growing.